Welcome, Voyager. Before us tonight is a world with edges. Not the sharp kind you might find on a cliff, but the rounded, painted surface of a sphere that has forgotten half of itself. It is 1492, the same year caravels push into the Atlantic, yet on this globe there is no sign of the Americas. The seas stretch unbroken, the landmasses curve only so far, and then they stop, as if nothing lay beyond. This is Martin Behaim's Erdapfel, a handcrafted image of the Earth that reflects how Europeans saw their world just before their horizons split open. If you've ever tried to draw your own map from memory and accidentally left off a major continent, you might feel a quiet kinship with poor Martin. He was not a careless man, just a man of his moment, and his moment had not yet heard the news from across the ocean. Before we set sail, if you enjoy these voyages, remember to like this one, subscribe for the next, and drop a set of coordinates in the comments so I know where you are listening from. If your location has a story stitched into its landscape, we may set sail there in a future episode. So settle back now, let the air feel as soft as an evening breeze coming off a sheltered bay, with the slow roll of water somewhere just out of sight. Our story tonight begins in Nuremberg, a city in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire in the late 15th century, where a man named Martin Behaim returned from years abroad to find his name already tied to stories of exploration. Born around 1459, Behaim was trained as a merchant, but the currents of his life carried him farther than most of his peers. He sailed with Portuguese expeditions, spent time on the islands of the Azores, and moved in circles where maps were more than curiosities. They were tools of trade, defense, and pride. The Erdapfel, which translates to Earth Apple in his native German, was commissioned by the Nuremberg Council in 1490. The idea was not to create a navigational chart, but to produce a grand object, an ornamental yet instructive sphere that would show the known world in 3 dimensions. Globes at that time were exceedingly rare, partly because they were difficult to make, and partly because most European knowledge of the world was still comfortably served by flat maps rooted in medieval tradition. Constructed over the course of 2 years, the globe's base was a hollow sphere made from linen strips glued over a wooden frame, then coated with a mixture of chalk and glue to form a smooth surface. Onto this curved skin, hand-painted segments depicted the continents as Europeans imagined them. Europe at the center, Africa stretching far southward, Asia curling across the top and sweeping east. Between these were seas rendered in muted blues and greens, dotted with small islands and the occasional painted ship. The Americas were absent because, in 1490, the voyages of Columbus had not yet brought word back to Europe, and the Norse sagas that hinted at Western lands were not part of mainstream cartographic knowledge. What makes the Erdapfel so intriguing is how it reveals not just what was known, but how it was known. Behaim's sources included Ptolemy's Geographia, medieval portolan charts, and accounts from travelers such as Marco Polo. These were stitched together into a coherent whole, but like a patchwork quilt, the seams between traditions are visible. Asia appears far larger than it is in reality, a distortion inherited from classical sources, and the distance from Europe to Japan is rendered much shorter than it should be. This compression, ironically, would later fuel Columbus's conviction that sailing west to Asia was practical. The absence of the Americas is the most obvious omission, but the globe also leaves out much of the Pacific, Australia, and Antarctica, all still unknown to European mapmakers. In their place are stretches of open ocean, sometimes decorated with fanciful islands or cautionary notes about sea monsters. The creatures themselves are modest compared to the wild beasts of earlier medieval maps, but their presence still hints at a worldview in which the edges of knowledge were populated by uncertainty. The Erdapfel measures about 51 centimeters in diameter, large enough to invite lingering study yet small enough to be held and turned. Imagine a scholar in a candlelit room rotating the globe slowly, fingertips passing over the painted coastlines, pausing to read the neat Gothic script labeling distant lands. In an age before printed atlases became common, such a globe was both a marvel of craftsmanship and a status object, signaling that its owner was connected to the currents of human discovery. Nuremberg at the time was a city of craftsmen and merchants, linked to trade routes that carried goods and ideas from across Europe and beyond. Its printers produced books that traveled widely, and its artisans excelled in metalwork, clocks, and scientific instruments. A globe made here would carry the weight of that reputation, a marriage of art and technical skill. The commission to Behaim and his collaborators likely reflected both civic pride and the desire to place Nuremberg within the unfolding story of the wider world. Behaim himself was not the artist who painted the continents. That work was done by George Glockenden, a skilled illuminator. Behaim provided the geographic content and perhaps guided the arrangement, while Glockenden translated that information into the visual form we see today. The inscriptions that dot the globe include not only place names but short descriptions of regions, often drawn from older texts rather than first-hand knowledge. Some describe trade goods or political situations, others note distances or hazards. What is striking is how the globe reflects a synthesis of medieval and Renaissance thinking. The medieval influence is visible in the persistence of legendary places, such as the island of St. Brendan or the realm of Prester John, woven alongside more accurate coastlines. The Renaissance influence emerges in the globe's three-dimensional form and in its effort to integrate information from diverse sources into a single representation. This was not yet the age of rigorous, standardized cartography, but it was moving in that direction. In the quiet turning of the Erdapfel, you can almost hear the sound of a world on the brink of change. Within 2 years of its completion, Columbus would cross the Atlantic and return with news that would redraw maps and reorder trade. The empty western hemisphere of Behaim's globe would soon be crowded with new coastlines, islands, and names. Yet the Erdapfel would remain as it was, a snapshot of European understanding just before it shifted irrevocably. This tension between the fixed form of the globe and the fluid nature of geographic knowledge is part of what makes the Erdapfel so compelling. It is a reminder that every map, no matter how detailed, is provisional, captures a moment, a set of beliefs, and the limits of the information available. To hold such an object is to hold a memory, one that cannot be updated without erasing the original. When you look at it now, in the quiet of the Germanisches National Museum where it is kept, the paint faded but the lines still clear, it feels almost like eavesdropping on the 15th century. You can trace the routes imagined by merchants and explorers, feel the optimism in the sweep of their coastlines, and sense the blind spots that would soon be filled in. The missing half of the world is as present as the painted half, an absence that speaks as loudly as any detail. And so the Erdapfel turns slowly, its oceans unbroken, its continents slightly misplaced, its stories embedded in every stroke of paint. The globe does not apologize for what it does not know. It simply shows the world as it was seen, and in doing so, it shows us the world as it was about to be remade. In the decades following its creation, the Erdapfel became less a reference for navigation and more a historical curiosity. The very events that rendered it outdated also made it fascinating. As Portuguese caravels edged around the African coast toward India, and Spanish galleons pushed west into the Caribbean, the globe's omissions grew starker. Each newly charted coastline was like a quiet rebuke to its painted oceans, but also a testament to how far the known world had expanded in so short a time. The people of Nuremberg could point to it and remember when Asia seemed only a short voyage westward, when the spice trade felt within easy reach if one could simply find the right route. The story of Martin Behaim himself has long been debated. Some historians question his role as an explorer, suggesting that his presence in Portugal was more administrative than adventurous, and that his influence on navigation may have been less than he claimed. He had, after all, a talent for placing himself near important people and events, a skill that could earn a man both reputation and suspicion. Yet, whatever his exact contributions, the Erdapfel ensures his name endures, bound to one of the last great maps of a world still bounded by the limits of classical geography. Globes of this kind were difficult to make not only because of their craftsmanship, but because the Earth's curved surface resisted easy translation from flat charts. Each segment of the map had to be carefully drawn on paper or parchment, then applied to the sphere without distorting coastlines or inscriptions. The Erdapfel survives as one of the earliest examples to use this process successfully, though its makers did not intend it to survive centuries. The materials linen, wood, and glue were vulnerable to damp and insects, and only careful conservation has allowed it to remain largely intact. Turning the globe, one notices details that speak to the worldviews of its time. Off the coast of Africa, notes about gold and ivory signal the commercial interests that drove European contact. In Asia, descriptions of silk, spices, and pearls evoke the long-distance trade networks that had operated for centuries. There are also passages describing Christian communities in far-flung lands, reflecting the medieval European hope of finding allies in the East against the Muslim powers that dominated much of the Mediterranean trade. These details were not mere decoration. They shaped how merchants, rulers, and scholars thought about distant regions. One particularly telling feature is the depiction of Japan, labeled as Cipangu, after Marco Polo's account. On the Erdapfel, Cipangu sits far closer to Europe than in reality, placed just east of Asia's coast across a relatively narrow stretch of ocean. This error, inherited from earlier sources, would later play into Columbus's calculations when he sought funding for his westward voyage. To a mind steeped in maps like Behaim's, the idea that one could sail directly from Spain to Asia without encountering a vast continent in between seemed plausible. The omission of the Americas, of course, was not unique to Behaim's globe. No European mapmaker in 1490 had reliable knowledge of such lands. But the Erdapfel freezes that omission into a permanent artifact, an unintentional monument to the moment before contact. When you look at it today, knowing what lay across those painted oceans, the effect can be almost disorienting. The mind wants to fill the blank spaces with the familiar outlines of South and North America. Yet the globe resists, holding to its own version of reality. There is also an aesthetic quietness to the Erdapfel. Unlike the exuberant medieval Mappe Mundi, which often crowded their surfaces with saints, monsters, and allegories, Behaim's globe feels restrained. Its seas are open and pale, its landmasses washed in gentle tones. The ornamentation is present but not overwhelming, as if its makers wanted the focus to remain on the geography itself. This makes the gaps, the missing half of the world, even more apparent. The restraint is almost modern, yet the errors remind you that it belongs firmly to the 15th century. In the centuries after its creation, the Erdapfel passed through various hands before finding a permanent home in the Germanisches National Museum in Nuremberg. The fact that it stayed in the city of its birth is remarkable, given how easily such objects could be lost to war, neglect, or dispersal of collections. By the 19th century, it was already recognized as a rare survival from the early age of European globe-making. Scholars pored over its inscriptions, tracing the origins of its place names and trying to identify the sources Behaim might have used. The globe's preservation was not without challenges. Over time, its surface darkened from exposure, and some areas of paint began to flake. Conservation work in the 20th century sought to stabilize it without over-restoring, preserving the patina of age that speaks to its centuries-long journey. To stand before it today is to see both the artistry of its creation and the wear of its survival. The lettering remains legible. The coastlines still curve as they did under Glockenden's brush, but there is a softness to the colors that feels almost like the fading of a memory. Thinking about the Erdapfel also invites reflection on the idea of completeness in knowledge. To the people of 1490, the globe did not feel unfinished. It was a synthesis of the best information available, a rounded whole that reflected their world. The Americas were not missing, they were simply not part of the mental geography of Europe. What we see as an absence, they saw as ocean. This is the nature of all maps. They reveal the world as filtered through the eyes and minds of those who make them, complete in their incompleteness. The Erdapfel also occupies an interesting position between medieval and modern timekeeping. In a medieval worldview, the shape of the earth could be described philosophically or theologically, with biblical references and symbolic directions. The Renaissance impulse, by contrast, sought empirical detail, measurement, and comparison. Behaim's globe embodies both impulses, holding on to legends even as it leans toward proportion and scale. It is as if two ages met in the turning of its axis, neither fully yielding to the other. In this way, the Erdapfel can be read as more than a map. It is a cultural hinge. Within its curved surface lies the last confident expression of a Eurocentric geography that saw Asia as the farthest east, Africa as a southward descent into wealth and mystery, and Europe as the familiar center. Within just a few decades, that mental map would be reshaped by encounters with the Americas, the Pacific, and a circumnavigated globe. Behaim's work became, unintentionally, a record of the before. Today, when you visit the museum, the globe is displayed in a climate-controlled case, slowly turned for viewers so that every part of its surface can be seen without the touch of human hands. Its presence in that quiet room is strangely calming. The muted tones, the careful script, the faint traces of gilding all invite a slower gaze. You might find yourself leaning in to read an inscription, tracing the delicate coastline of West Africa or the imagined islands off the coast of Asia, and feeling the strange intimacy of holding someone else's mental image of the world. In that moment, the missing half of the globe is not a flaw, but an invitation. It asks you to imagine standing in Nuremberg in 1490, looking at these same painted seas, knowing only that something was out there, beyond sight and beyond certainty. For Behaim and his contemporaries, that unknown was vast and alluring. For us, it is a reminder that the world, in every age, has its blank spaces, whether on maps or in the mind. If we think of the Erdapfel as a story in itself, it is a story told in the language of geography rather than sentences. The shape of the continents, the spacing between islands, the notes about goods and peoples, all are narrative choices. Even the absence of the Americas becomes a kind of plot twist, though one invisible to its original audience. Like any story, it reflects the preoccupations, aspirations, and blind spots of its creators. That is why, centuries later, we can still read it with interest, even if the world it depicts no longer exists. In looking closely at the globe, we find hints of the layered sources behind its making. The coastlines of Africa owe much to Portuguese voyages, particularly those under the command of Bartolomeu Dias, who in 1488 rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Parts of Asia draw on Marco Polo's 13th century account, which by Behaim's time had been copied and reinterpreted across Europe. Some islands in the Atlantic may have come from ancient legends of the Fortunate Isles or from sailors' tales told in Lisbon's docks. These sources did not blend perfectly. They created a composite world stitched together from threads of fact, speculation, and inherited belief. Behaim's position in Portugal during the 1480s likely gave him access to the latest nautical intelligence. Lisbon was then a hub of maritime innovation, home to shipyards, mapmakers, and merchants dealing in spices, gold, and exotic goods. Navigators brought back news of currents, winds, and coastlines, which royal cartographers compiled into increasingly accurate charts. Yet secrecy was also part of the trade. Maps could be guarded as state assets, their details too valuable to share widely. This might explain why the Erdapfel has some surprisingly accurate stretches of coastline alongside vast errors. The public-facing geography lagged behind the guarded knowledge of pilots and princes. One of the most haunting aspects of the Erdapfel is how it captures a Europe on the brink of contact with a new hemisphere without knowing it. Within 2 years of its completion, Columbus would sail west from Spain, not to prove the Earth was round. This was already accepted in learned circles, but to shorten the route to Asia. His landfall in the Bahamas in 1492 would begin a chain of encounters that upended Behaim's carefully painted sphere. The globe's seas, once imagined as unbroken expanses between Europe and Asia, would suddenly be crowded with new coastlines. If you stand in front of the globe today, you can imagine the moment when news of these discoveries first reached Nuremberg. Perhaps someone compared the reports to Behaim's work, tracing a finger across the Atlantic to the place where the new lands might be. The Erdapfel would not have been updated. Globes were not easy to alter without damaging them. Instead, it remained as it was, a silent witness to geography's acceleration. Its stillness became a contrast to the moving frontier of exploration. This dual existence, as both tool and artifact, is part of what makes the Erdapfel so compelling. When it was made, it was a contemporary object, reflecting the best public knowledge of its day. Now it is an antique, valuable precisely because it preserves a vision of the world that time has left behind. The same painted waters that once guided the imagination of merchants and scholars now guide the curiosity of historians, geographers, and visitors who wander the museum's quiet halls. The globe also speaks to the way humans use maps and models not only to navigate but to define themselves. To draw a map is to decide what is worth including, naming, and depicting. The choice to fill the oceans with certain islands, to label certain cities, or to omit entire continents is not just a matter of information, it is a statement of perspective. In 1490, the perspective was one of Eurasian centrality, with Africa stretching southward and the Atlantic functioning as a western edge rather than a middle sea. The Pacific did not exist on this globe, not because it was small, but because it was unimagined. One can also sense the craftsmanship in the globe's physical form. The two hemispheres of its wooden shell meet cleanly at the equator, and the meridian ring that once allowed it to be tilted is still visible. The paper gores were cut to fit precisely, their edges aligned so that coastlines run uninterrupted across the seams. Lettering was applied with a steady hand, each inscription carefully positioned to avoid smudging or overlap. These details remind us that this was not an industrial product but a singular creation, the result of hours of skilled labor by artisans who worked without the measuring tools we take for granted today. The survival of the Erdapfel across more than 5 centuries is as much a story of care as of luck. Wars have come and gone, including the devastation of Nuremberg in the Second World War. Changes in ownership could have led to neglect or sale. Yet somehow it remained within the city, passing from private possession into the stewardship of the museum. This continuity allows it to be more than a historical object. It is also a piece of Nuremberg's own story, a thread that connects its 15th century merchant culture to the modern day. Standing before it, you might notice how small it is compared to modern classroom globes. Its diameter is just over half a meter, making the continents seem more intimate, the oceans less vast. This scale invites a kind of closeness. You can take in a large section of the surface with a single glance, turning it gently to follow a route from Lisbon around Africa's coast toward India. The globe does not overwhelm. It invites quiet engagement, much as it might have in Behaim's time when a visitor to his workshop could trace a fingertip along the spice route or the imagined islands of the Indies. In contemplating the Erdapfel, it is tempting to see it as a relic of a simpler time, but the world it depicts was anything but simple. Trade networks spanned continents, political rivalries shaped exploration, and navigators faced months-long voyages through unpredictable seas. The globe's calm seas and orderly coastlines mask the dangers and uncertainties of the voyages they represent. It is, in this sense, a kind of idealized vision, a reminder that maps do not just record geography. They also smooth and shape it for the eye. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Erdapfel is that all maps are temporary. The moment they are drawn, they begin to age. New lands are charted, coastlines erode, names change, borders shift. Yet in that aging lies their value, for each map preserves a world as it was once understood. The Erdapfel preserves the last moment before Europe's mental geography doubled in size, before the Atlantic ceased to be an edge and became a center. To look at it now is to step into that moment, to see the world as it was when the unknown lay just beyond a few inches of painted blue. And so our voyage tonight draws to a close. The globe remains in its case, slowly turning under the museum's lights, its painted continents and imagined islands passing in quiet procession. The missing half of the world still waits, not to be filled in, but to be acknowledged as part of the story. For every place we know, there was a time when it was not yet on the map, and for every blank space filled, another appears in our understanding. The Erdapfel turns, and the turning is endless. Close your eyes now and picture it. Half a meter of painted earth, the smooth curve under your fingertips, the small lettering naming cities you have never seen. Around it is the soft murmur of a museum hall, the faint echo of footsteps on polished stone. Outside, the city of Nuremberg carries on, much as it did 5 centuries ago, though the world it inhabits is immeasurably larger. In your mind, you can turn the globe once more, watching the painted waters slip past until they meet again at the seam, the cycle unbroken. Our story tonight began with a globe that showed only half the world, and it ends with the thought that every map, every model, every description we make of the Earth is in some sense incomplete. That is not a flaw, but an invitation to keep looking, to keep asking, to keep turning the sphere in search of what lies beyond the painted edge. Sleep well, Voyager, and may your own maps, whatever they may be, lead you somewhere worth finding. Welcome, Voyager. On our second journey of the night, we find ourselves along the banks of a river that plays by its own rules, a waterway that seems to have made a quiet pact with the moon. In the northern reaches of Brazil's Maranhão state, the Rio Maiarim carries silt, fish, and the small wooden canoes of riverfolk toward the Atlantic. Yet, for a few nights each month, as the moon swells to its brightest, the current hesitates, then turns back on itself, as if a force from beyond the treetops has whispered an instruction. The story of this river is not one of human engineering or miscalculation, but of natural rhythms so grand they make the everyday order of things look negotiable. You could chart it, measure it, even try to predict it, but the truth is that it feels a little like watching someone row a canoe backward without dipping in, or it makes you wonder, if rivers can change their mind, maybe maps should be printed in pencil. Before we start paddling into the details, I'll ask you to like and subscribe, and drop a coordinate in the comments so I know where you're listening from. If there's a story tied to your location, it might just become a future voyage. Settle in. There's a night breeze slipping over the water, carrying the scent of wet wood and a hint of salt. Somewhere beyond the mangroves, waves murmur against the tidal flats. Our story tonight begins in the city of Arari, a riverside town on the Miram's banks, where fishermen and ferry captains have always known that the moon has more to say here than anywhere else. The Miram's source lies far inland, near the Serra do Itapecuru, a modest highland that feeds the river with seasonal rains. From there it winds more than 800 kilometers northeast, gathering tributaries and sediment, until it reaches the wide estuarine plain that connects it to the Baía de São Marcos. This is not an ordinary river mouth. Rather than spilling cleanly into the Atlantic, the Maya Rim joins a maze of tidal channels and mangrove forests, where the ocean's pulse pushes back against the freshwater flow. The reason the river can reverse is written into this geography. A long, shallow estuary that acts like a funnel, amplifying incoming tides. The phenomenon becomes most dramatic during full and new moons, when the gravitational pull of the moon and sun align. These spring tides are stronger than the daily ebb and flow, drawing seawater deep into the river's channel. The water doesn't just slow, it surges upriver in a churning wall called a pororoca. The pororoca is more famous in the Amazon's Guama and Araguari rivers, where surfers ride its wave for kilometers, but the Maya Rim has its own version, smaller yet no less striking. On some nights, the tidal bore's crest can rise 2 meters high, foaming and roaring against the normal current, snapping branches along the banks. Even after the bore passes, the river continues flowing upstream for hours, filling its channels and backwaters until the tide turns once more. Early Portuguese settlers in Maranhão recorded the pororoca in the 1600s, though the indigenous peoples of the region had known it for countless generations. The Tupinamba and later the Guajajara told stories of the moon calling the river to return home, a command obeyed without question. These oral histories didn't separate the physical from the spiritual. The tidal bore was both a natural event and a sign of cosmic order. Watching the water climb against itself could feel like seeing time reverse, a reminder that even what feels certain can be undone. Scientists today measure the Miriam's reversals with tide gauges and current meters, but the data does little to soften its strangeness. The river's slope is so slight near its mouth that a single strong tide can push the salt water far inland. The funnel shape of the Baía de São Marcos concentrates tidal energy, and seasonal river discharge can either dampen or magnify the reversal. In the rainy season, when the Maya Rim runs high, the incoming tide meets a stubborn wall of fresh water, and the pororoca shrinks. In the dry season, with the current weakened, the bore travels farther and lasts longer. Traveling upriver from Arari during a reversal, you would pass long wooden docks that suddenly face the wrong way, fishing nets drifting toward the forest instead of the sea, and children shouting as they toss sticks into the water to watch them vanish upstream. Boatmen adjust their schedules to the lunar calendar, choosing either to ride the tide inland or wait until it turns to make the downstream trip less punishing. The change is swift enough that a traveler who dozes off on deck might wake confused. The landmarks unchanged, but the waters slipping the other way beneath them. The Miriam's reversals are part of a broader tidal dance along Brazil's north coast, where the mouth of the Amazon and its many neighbors feel the Atlantic's reach hundreds of kilometers inland. The coastline here is fractured and low, dotted with islands like São Luís and Itapera, and webbed with channels such as the Pindare and Grujão. All of these waterways respond to the same lunar and solar rhythms, but the Miriam's geography makes it a particularly dramatic stage. The pororoca here is shorter-lived than in some larger rivers, but it comes with a suddenness that locals compare to a startled animal. A rush, a roar, and then an entirely new river for the night. During colonial times, these tides could be both a hazard and a help. Flat-bottomed boats carrying sugar, rice, and hides to the ports of São Luís might be stranded if they misjudged the reversal, pinned upriver by a flood that came from the wrong direction. On the other hand, skilled pilots could use the bore to carry them inland faster than paddles or poles alone. In this way, the moon became a quiet but decisive partner in commerce, dictating when goods could move and when they must wait. Today, many visitors come to Arari or nearby towns specifically to witness the pororoca. Standing on the bank as the tide begins to push is an exercise in patience and subtlety. First, the river stills, then a faint rustle rises from downstream, like wind through leaves. A moment later, the bore appears, curling white against the brown water, scattering herons and startling fish into the air. Once it passes, the water swells upriver, and the entire landscape seems to exhale. At night, under a full moon, the bore's foam glows pale, and the upriver current carries reflections of the moon itself, sliding back toward its source as if returning a borrowed light. Those who live along the Maya Rim do not treat the reversal as an oddity. It is as much a part of the river's nature as its bends and islands. Elders speak of years when the bore came early or late, of nights when it rose higher than expected, or seasons when it barely arrived at all. Children learn to read the lunar phases before they can tell time, and fishermen still glance skyward before setting their nets. In a place where the river sometimes runs backward, certainty is never absolute, but neither is it needed. The Miram's moonlit tides invite a kind of humility. They remind us that not all movement is forward, and not all progress is in the direction we expect. The reversal is not a mistake in the river's design, but a sign that it is part of a larger system, one that reaches beyond its own banks and listens to forces far away. Watching it turn is a lesson in scale. You can measure the water's speed, but you cannot hold back the pull that moves it. From the town of Vittoria do Maya Rim, farther downstream from Harare, the influence of the Atlantic becomes even more pronounced, and the reversal can be felt with a physical jolt beneath the hull of a moored boat. Here, the river widens, and the mangroves along its edges form dense walls, their roots arching like stilts into the muddy water. These mangrove systems, some stretching for kilometers, are not passive bystanders. They filter the silt and slow the incoming tide, shaping the Pororoca's character from season to season. Locals say that when the mangroves are thick with leaves, the bore arrives quieter, muffled by the foliage, while during leaner months the rush of water echoes through bare branches, sounding louder than usual in the still night. Scientists studying the Maya Rim have noted how these forests act as natural breakwaters, diffusing the energy of the bore while providing shelter for countless species of fish, crabs, and birds that time their own feeding patterns to the rhythm of the tide. It is in this lower reach that the Miram's reversal shows its longest inland push, sometimes driving more than 70 kilometers against the current before fading. The effect is not a simple back-and-forth motion but a layering of currents, salt water racing upriver at the surface while fresh water continues to slip seaward in the depths. This two-way traffic in a single channel creates turbulent mixing zones that challenge navigation, particularly for the small motorboats that connect the riverside settlements. A pilot must read the surface, the color, and texture of the water to know where the tidal energy is strongest. It is easy to imagine how, centuries ago, without engines, only the most experienced boatmen could safely ride the Pororoca upriver without capsizing. The Miram's reversal also shapes the human calendar here in ways that go beyond fishing and travel. The Catholic festivals in towns like Harare, Vittoria do Maya Rim, and Bacabal often coincide with full moons, not for any liturgical reason, but because the tidal timing ensures that visitors from coastal settlements can arrive more easily, carried inland by the bore. This practical convenience has woven itself into tradition, creating celebrations that begin with music and processions in the town squares but start, quite literally, with the moon's pull on the sea. Oral histories tell of wedding processions traveling by boat under moonlight, the Pororoca lending their journey a strange sense of ceremony as the water carried them backward toward their home villages. The Pororoca of the Maya Rim is part of a larger family of tidal bores found around the world. In the Severn River in England, the Chintang River in China, the Petitcodiac in Canada, and of course in the Amazon basin. What sets the Maya Rim apart is the intimacy of its setting. This is not a broad, empty expanse of water but a channel enclosed by forest, where the bore can arrive suddenly around a bend, the noise bouncing between tree trunks. Some travelers compare the experience to hearing a train approach before seeing it, though here the track is liquid, and the engine is the moon. The limited visibility makes the Miriam's Poroka feel more like an ambush than a spectacle. One moment you are gliding with the current, the next the river itself has changed allegiance. Ecologists have studied how this oscillating flow pattern shapes the aquatic life of the Maya Rim. Certain fish species, such as mullet and snook, use the incoming tide to migrate upstream into brackish nurseries, where the mangroves offer shelter from larger predators. The reverse current also carries nutrient-rich silt from the sea far inland, depositing it along the banks and fertilizing floodplain crops. Rice paddies in Maranhão benefit from this unexpected delivery, their yields subtly linked to the moon's cycle. Farmers here may never consult tide tables, yet their planting seasons still mirror the lunar calendar, an unspoken legacy of centuries spent watching the water. The Poroka also has its dangers. Logs and debris swept up by the reversal can strike boats with force, and sudden surges can overwhelm small craft. Those unfamiliar with the river's rhythms may find themselves stranded upriver as the tide turns again, forced to wait hours for the current to resume its seaward course. For this reason, seasoned boatmen are often hired as guides for visitors seeking to witness the phenomenon. These pilots navigate not by landmarks alone but by the smell of the air, the feel of the hull beneath their feet, and the subtle shift in the sound of water against the bow, a skill that seems almost instinctive but is born of long apprenticeship. In São Luís, the capital of Maranhão and a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the influence of the tides is felt on a grander scale. The city sits on an island at the confluence of the Baía de São Marcos and the Baía de São José, both of which channel tidal energy toward the mainland rivers, including the Maya Rim. The stone seawalls and colonial-era warehouses along the waterfront are reminders of centuries of tidal commerce, when goods were loaded and unloaded in time with the moon. Mariners here have always known that to sail without regard for the lunar phase is to court frustration. Even today, container ships bound for the port adjust their schedules to ride the highest tides, a practice that indirectly connects the modern shipping industry to the same gravitational cycles that reverse the Miriam's flow. Historical records from the 18th and 19th centuries reveal how misunderstood the reversal once was among outsiders. Some European visitors described it as a seasonal flood, not realizing it occurred twice each lunar month. Others attributed it to hidden springs beneath the riverbed that supposedly released their water upstream. It took careful observation and the work of naturalists traveling in the Portuguese colonial service to document the tidal bore's true cause. These reports, sent back to Lisbon, were often written in a tone of restrained astonishment, as if the authors were reluctant to admit that the ocean could so thoroughly invade a river's domain. In the Miriam's basin, however, no one doubts the ocean's reach. Life here is lived in a constant negotiation with water, and the reversal is only one expression of that dialogue. The floodplains are cultivated in the dry season, then surrendered to the river in the rains. Fishing nets are set with the tides turning in mind, and houses on stilts stand ready for whatever height the water might reach. The Poroka is dramatic, yes, but it is also ordinary, a reminder that in tidal rivers, movement is rarely a straight line. As night deepens and the moon climbs higher over Maranhão, the Maya Rim might be flowing upstream again. Somewhere along its banks, a fisherman leans against his canoe, waiting for the right moment to cast his net. The mangroves whisper in the breeze, and the river seems to hum with energy drawn from a source it can neither see nor refuse. The tide will turn soon enough, and the water will return to the sea. But for now the current is a silver ribbon pulling inland, carrying reflections of the moon into the dark heart of the forest. Far upriver, beyond the reach of even the strongest Poroka, the Maya Rim loses its tidal character and becomes a more familiar freshwater river, flowing steadily toward the sea. Yet here too, the full moon leaves its mark, not in reverse currents but in subtler ways: higher water levels, shifting eddies, and the migration of certain fish that respond to the same lunar cues as their coastal counterparts. These upper reaches are narrower, shaded by galleries of overhanging trees, and the villages that cling to the banks live at a slower pace. Still, news of the Pororoca travels this far inland, and elders speak of it as if it were a living relative, predictable, powerful, and not to be underestimated. Children who grow up here may never see the reversal themselves until they are older, yet they learn its timing the way others learn the seasons of rain and harvest. In this upper basin, tributaries like the Grigio and Pindare bring their own stories into the Maya Rim, each carrying rainwater from distant highlands. These tributaries feed into the river's main stem in a way that mirrors the meeting of ocean and river downstream, two currents joining, each with its own character. During high tides at the coast, the Pororoca's pulse can sometimes be traced faintly upriver as far as the confluence with the Pindare, though by then it is more suggestion than force. Local boatmen say the water takes on a different smell at these times, carrying a salty tang that surprises those used to the purely freshwater taste. It is a fleeting reminder of the sea's presence, felt hundreds of kilometers from the coast. The Maya Rim Basin has been a corridor of movement for centuries, not just for water but for people. Indigenous groups navigated its length long before Portuguese colonization, and many of their place names survive alongside colonial ones. The Tupinamba, for example, had their own words for the tides and for the phases of the moon, and their vocabulary captured a close observation of how these forces shaped fishing and travel. When Jesuit missionaries arrived in the 17th century, they relied on indigenous guides to move through the maze of rivers and tributaries, often timing their journeys to take advantage of tidal surges without fully understanding the mechanics behind them. The fusion of indigenous knowledge and colonial mapping would, over generations, produce the composite understanding of the river that exists today. Navigation along the Maya Rim is still dictated as much by tide as by technology. The Pororoca's schedule can either shorten or lengthen a journey by hours, depending on whether a boat rides with or against it. Even with motorized craft, the difference in fuel consumption is noticeable, and seasoned captains plan accordingly. In some villages, the arrival of the boar is a community event, not in the sense of a festival, but as a moment when people gather instinctively at the water's edge to watch it pass. A few even set their fishing nets just before the reversal, counting on the turbulent waters to drive fish into them. In this way, the Pororoca is both a challenge and a gift, shaping work and leisure alike. On moonlit nights when the boar runs strong, the river's surface can appear silvered, every ripple catching the light. Those who travel at these times speak of a disorienting effect. Without landmarks visible in the dark, the sensation of moving backward along the river can feel like being pulled into the sky itself. This optical illusion has inspired more than one riverside folktale, many of which blur the line between astronomy and hydrology. One story tells of the moon sending a silver rope down into the river to pull the water toward her. Another speaks of a celestial canoe traveling upstream each month to collect the dreams of those who sleep along the banks. These tales, though fanciful, reflect a deeper truth, that the people here live with the moon as a daily presence, not just a distant light. The Pororoca has also drawn scientific curiosity from beyond Brazil. In the late 20th century, researchers began to measure its speed, height, and inland reach with precision instruments, seeking to understand how climate variations, river discharge, and sea level changes influence its behavior. They found that during years of high rainfall, when the Maya Rim carries more fresh water to the coast, the bore can be slightly diminished, its upstream push blunted by the stronger seaward flow. In drier years, the opposite occurs. The ocean's pulse travels farther inland, its energy unopposed. This sensitivity to changing conditions makes the Maya Rim an important natural laboratory for studying the interactions between river systems and coastal processes. Yet, despite the attention, The Maya Rim remains far less famous than its Amazonian neighbors, perhaps because its pororoca is more intimate in scale. Surfers do not flock here in large numbers as they do to the Amazon's Guama and Araguari rivers, where boars can run for kilometers with clean faces suitable for riding. The Miram's narrower channel, tight bends, and dense vegetation make it less suited to such exploits, though a few adventurous paddlers have attempted it. For most, the appeal lies not in conquering the boar but in experiencing it. Feeling the river reverse beneath their boat, hearing the forest react to the sudden change, and knowing that the cause lies far away in the gravitational pull of the moon. When the tide finally turns again, the seaward current returns with a familiar steadiness, as if nothing unusual had happened. Life along the banks resumes its usual rhythm. Boats set off toward the coast, fishermen mend their nets, children wade in the shallows. But the knowledge lingers. In a matter of hours, the ocean will call again, and the river will answer. This cycle, repeated over countless generations, weaves itself into the identity of the Maya Rim and those who depend on it. It is a reminder that rivers are not merely pathways from land to sea. They are participants in a larger conversation, one that includes the moon, the tides, and the unseen forces that bind water to the wider world. As our journey on the Maya Rim draws to a close, the night air grows cooler, and the forest hums with unseen life. Somewhere downstream, the first ripples of the next pororoca are forming, born of an ocean we cannot yet see but can imagine clearly. The river flows toward it, then against it, and in that constant shifting we glimpse a truth older than maps, that the boundaries between river and sea, between land and tide, are not fixed but negotiated anew with every full moon. In this negotiation, the Maya Rim finds its rhythm, and so do the people who live along its winding course. Here, beneath the moon's watch, water moves not only forward but backward, answering to a call from beyond the horizon. And if you stand quietly on its banks, listening to the hush before the reversal, you might feel that call yourself. A pull as gentle and insistent as the tide, drawing you upstream into the silver dark. Welcome, Voyager. On our third story of the night, we drift to the shores of Ghana, where the boundary between ocean and land is marked not only by the foam of waves, but by voices in the wind. Along certain hidden coves of the West African coastline, the air carries sounds that seem to form words, syllables that rise and fall as though the sea itself is speaking. This is a place where the night tide brings not just salt water but the suggestion of memory, where those who linger long enough might hear their own names whispered back to them from the dark. It is a story of geography and acoustics, of how wind and stone can conspire to create the illusion of language, and of the cultural lore that has grown around these murmuring shores. There is a quiet truth here, one that locals know well. Not all voices require lungs, and not all stories require tellers. Much like the echo in a canyon or the hum inside a seashell, the whispered names are an effect of place and structure. Yet to stand here under the moon and hear them is to be convinced, if only for a moment, that the earth itself remembers who walks its edge. Of course, if a beach starts calling you by name, it might be worth checking whether it also knows your birthday, though I would not count on it sending a card. Before we set foot in the sand, I should remind you to like this voyage if you enjoy it, subscribe for future journeys, and leave a coordinate in the comments so I know where in the world you are listening from. If your location holds a story that waits quietly in the folds of geography, it may just appear in a future night's exploration. Settle in now, and let the imagined warmth of an evening breeze drift in through the open shutters. Somewhere nearby, a low fire burns down to embers, and beyond it the slow hush of waves keeps time with the heartbeat of the shore. Our story tonight begins on Ghana's central coast, where the Gulf of Guinea curves inward in a series of bays and headlands. In this part of the world, the coastline is a living mosaic of sandy beaches, rocky promontories, and mangrove-lined estuaries. Here, the Atlantic Ocean presses against the land with both force and patience, reshaping it over centuries, carving coves and inlets that alter the way air and water move. One such cove, tucked between two weathered cliffs near the fishing town of Winneba, is known among locals as Nsawam Frama, which in Akan can be rendered as the wind that names. The name itself has been in use for generations, long before coastal scientists began to study its peculiar soundscape. The cove is not large, perhaps 200 meters from one rocky arm to the other, but it is shaped with a subtle precision that seems almost intentional. The headlands are pocked with cavities formed by centuries of wave action, and these cavities act as resonating chambers, amplifying and shaping the wind's passage. When the trade winds sweep in from the southwest during certain seasons, they funnel through these openings with just the right speed and pressure to produce tones and patterns. These patterns, to a human ear accustomed to finding meaning in noise, can resemble fragments of words. In the stillness of night, with the surrounding air otherwise quiet, the effect can be startling. Local fishermen have long claimed that the cove does not speak every night, and indeed the conditions for the phenomenon are precise. The tide must be at a mid-level, neither pressing fully against the cliff base nor retreating too far from it. The wind direction must align with the axis of the cove, and the humidity in the air, altering the density of sound waves, must be high enough to carry the lower frequencies. Under these conditions, the sound can seem to emerge from all directions at once, as though the cliffs, the sand, and the water have joined in the conversation. Cultural interpretations of the whispers vary. Among the Afuta people, whose ancestral lands include the stretch of coast, there are oral histories linking the cove's voice to the spirits of those lost at sea. One tale tells of a fisherman who vanished during a storm and whose name was heard in the wind by his family 3 nights later. In another, the cove calls to children playing nearby, warning them away from high tides. While outsiders might see these as cautionary stories woven around a natural sound, for many locals, the physical and spiritual explanations coexist comfortably. The cove is both an acoustic chamber and a threshold to the unseen. Scientists who have studied Nsawam Frama approach it through the lens of aeroacoustics, the study of how air movement produces sound. By measuring wind velocity, cliff geometry, and wave activity, they have mapped the resonant frequencies of the cove and found that certain harmonics align with the human voice range, particularly between 300 and 800 Hz. This overlap increases the likelihood that listeners will perceive the sounds as speech-like, a phenomenon known in psychology as pareidolia, our brain's tendency to find familiar patterns in random data. It is the same mechanism that lets us hear ghostly messages when music is played backward or see faces in clouds. Still, there is something different about hearing such patterns in the living environment. Standing in the cove on a moonlit night, the waves pulling at the sand around your ankles, the wind carrying what sounds like your name, the experience is visceral. Some listeners report feeling as if the voice comes from within their own head rather than from the air around them. Others say the sound shifts depending on where they stand. Closer to the cliff base, the tone deepens. Nearer the waterline, it becomes higher and more insistent. This variability gives the impression of an interactive presence, one that responds to the listener's movement. Geographically, the cove's setting enhances its isolation. A dense fringe of coastal vegetation shields it from the inland road, and the approach requires walking along a narrow, sandy path that winds through palm groves before descending to the beach. During the day, The cove is picturesque but unremarkable compared to Ghana's other beaches. It is at night, especially under a bright moon, that it becomes something else entirely. The silver light reveals the wet sheen of the rocks, and the shadows in their recesses seem deeper. The wind picks up in pulses, as if inhaling and exhaling, and the first syllables ride in on that breath. Mariners navigating this coast have their own version of the story. In the age of sail, ships hugging the shoreline at night sometimes reported hearing faint voices over the water. Logbooks from the 19th century, kept by European traders and explorers, mention the Murmuring Bay or the Beach of Whispers, though few could pinpoint its location precisely. For sailors accustomed to reading the wind as a matter of survival, the phenomenon was simply another reminder of the ocean's many moods. The interplay of wind, tide, and stone here is part of a broader pattern found in coastal environments worldwide. Similar singing sands and whistling cliffs exist in places as far-flung as Oregon, Oman, and the Isle of Skye. Yet each location produces its own signature sounds, tuned by its unique geology and climate. In Ghana, Nsawam Frama stands out not for being the loudest or most musical, but for its uncanny alignment with the rhythms of speech. It is not merely a drone or whistle, but something that rises and falls in a way our ears interpret as language. And once the mind catches hold of that pattern, it becomes difficult to hear it as anything else. The villagers of Winneba sometimes bring visitors to the cove during the annual Abokir festival, when the community honors its traditions with hunting, music, and dance. For those willing to walk the moonlit path after the festivities, the beach offers its own performance, a quieter, slower rhythm than the drums in the town square, but no less memorable. Elders say that if you listen closely, you might hear not only your name but the names of places, events, or ancestors long gone. Whether this is imagination, memory, or the wind's own invention, no one can say for certain. It is here, between the solid earth and the shifting sea, that we find our place in the story tonight. Standing at the threshold of the cove, the tide midway in its climb, the wind beginning to gather its breath. Far from the modern lights of Accra and Takoradi, the night here has a depth that allows sound to travel without the constant background hum of human activity. When the wind begins to flow into the cove, it meets the irregular cliff face at an angle that causes a scattering of turbulence. Each hollow, some as small as a clenched fist and others large enough to step inside, acts like the body of a musical instrument. Air passes across the openings in ways not unlike a flute or an organ pipe, producing notes that blend with the hiss of waves. What makes the phenomenon especially striking in Nsawam Frama is the range of these tones and the intervals between them, which create patterns that the human ear quickly associates with syllables. Our brains are finely tuned to detect the cadence of speech, so even a series of unrelated sounds can be stitched together in perception into words, particularly when heard in low light and under suggestive circumstances. The cliff stone itself plays an important role in shaping these sounds. This section of the coast is dominated by a mix of sandstone and laterite, the latter a reddish, iron-rich material that weathers into porous surfaces. The sandstone erodes differently, often forming smoother cavities with hard edges, while laterite wears into irregular, honeycombed patterns. Together, these materials create a complex surface for the wind to interact with, varying the pitch and timbre from one moment to the next. Seasonal changes alter the effect as well. In the dry Harmattan months, when dust from the Sahara drifts across West Africa, the air is drier and sound behaves differently than in the humid, rainy months when it carries more easily and warmly. From the perspective of local cultural memory, the cove has long been more than just a curiosity. It features in certain fishing taboos, where some elders insist that speaking loudly in the cove at night can disturb the wind's own speech and bring bad luck to the next day's catch. Children are sometimes told that the beach whispers only to those who have a story the ocean wants to hear. A gentle reminder that listening is as important as speaking. Oral historians in the region, known as anencism tellers, occasionally use the location as a performance space, weaving tales into the soundscape so that the audience hears the narrative intertwined with the cove's murmurs. In these moments, geography becomes part of the storytelling tradition itself, the environment not just a backdrop but an active participant. For those inclined toward scientific precision, measuring and recording these sounds has proven challenging. Portable recorders pick up the effect, but playback often lacks the immersive quality heard on site. Part of this is due to binaural perception. Our two ears capture slightly different sound information, which the brain uses to localize and interpret the source. In the cove, this spatial effect contributes to the illusion that the voice moves around the listener. Field researchers have used parabolic microphones and wind-resistant covers to isolate the tones, later analyzing them with spectrogram software. The results show peaks at frequencies common in human vowel sounds, explaining in part why they are so easily mistaken for names. However, stripped from their environmental context, these frequencies become more obviously natural in origin, their ghostly character fading in the laboratory. The Gulf of Guinea itself has a reputation for capricious weather, and wind conditions here can shift rapidly with the passage of small coastal squalls. These changes add unpredictability to the cove's whispers. A night that begins in silence may suddenly fill with sound as a breeze comes off the water, while a promising evening can fall quiet again if the air turns inland. Local fishermen read the subtle cues in the sky and water to anticipate such changes, and those familiar with Nsawam Frama know the signs of a whispering tide. A certain tilt of the palms toward the shore, a faint crosswind at the waterline, and a glassy stillness to the breaking waves. Stories from neighboring villages suggest that similar acoustic effects may exist in smaller coves along this part of the coast, though none are as well known. Some are said to produce low, moaning tones that resemble distant drums rather than speech, while others emit high-pitched whistles audible only when standing in a specific spot. The coastline here is fractured and varied, so it is plausible that multiple sites could create their own unique wind-driven sounds. In the case of Nsawam Frama, its relative seclusion and the dramatic character of its words have elevated it into both folklore and the awareness of those interested in natural sound phenomena. Even with all the physical explanations, the emotional impact of the beach remains intact. Visitors often remark that the first time they hear their own name, or something close to it, in the wind, it feels like a private message. Whether this is coincidence, suggestion, or the inevitable result of language-like sounds, the effect can be powerful. In the darkness, with only the moon to witness, the mind becomes more receptive to patterns, and a simple gust of air can take on significance. This interplay between perception and environment is at the heart of so many such legends around the world. The approach to the cove during the night is part of the ritual. The path narrows between thick coastal vegetation, where leaves rustle quietly overhead and the smell of salt intensifies with each step. The sound of the ocean, muffled at first, grows clearer as the land drops toward the shore. Then, just before the beach comes into view, there is a space where the wind passes through a gap in the trees, offering the first faint hint of the cove's voice. By the time the visitor emerges onto the sand, the full sound has begun, layered and shifting, carried on the night air. It is an invitation and a mystery all at once. It is easy to imagine how such a place could become a repository for communal memory. In a fishing community, where the sea governs not only the economy but the rhythm of daily life, the ocean's messages might be taken as guidance or affirmation. If the cove calls a particular name before a voyage, it could be seen as a blessing, or perhaps a warning. These interpretations vary between families and even among individuals, creating a web of personal stories layered over the scientific reality. The two explanations do not compete. They coexist, much as the wind and waves share the same space without negating each other. In this way, Nsawam Frama becomes not just a geographical feature, but a living part of the community's relationship with the coastline. It sits quietly through the day, absorbing the heat of the sun and the scent of the sea. And then, when the conditions align, it exhales its strange syllables into the night. The whispers themselves are fleeting, but the impression they leave lingers, carried home in the minds of those who have heard them, and passed on in conversation and story. And so the moon rises higher over the gulf, the tide nudging closer to its mark, the wind gathering in the distance. Soon the cove will speak again, in a language older than the first human footprints on this sand, and the names it utters will be carried on the restless breath of the sea. Long before European cartographers began sketching this coastline on their maps, the people living along the Gulf of Guinea had established a deep familiarity with its moods and sounds. Oral traditions carried details about certain landmarks that were not merely geographic points but actors in the unfolding drama of sea and land. The beach we now call Nsawam Frama would have been known by those who traveled the shoreline in dugout canoes, its presence marked in memory by its ability to speak when the wind was right. These navigators, moving between fishing grounds and trading spots, learned to use both sight and sound to orient themselves. The cove's whisper might not have been a navigational beacon in the strict sense, but it served as a reminder that the land itself could provide signals and omens if one knew how to listen. The arrival of Europeans on this coast in the late 15th century brought new layers of record-keeping, but little attention was paid to such intangible phenomena. Early Portuguese and Dutch chroniclers focused on harbors, currents, and the availability of fresh water. For them, a whispering cove might be mentioned only in passing, if at all, and often stripped of its cultural meaning. Yet in the quiet margins of these accounts, one occasionally finds references to talking rocks or singing sands, phrases that suggest at least a partial awareness of what local communities had long known. Over time, as the colonial presence expanded, these natural curiosities were folded into travel lore, recounted by sailors in port taverns alongside other strange coastal tales. By the 19th century, when European scientific expeditions began cataloging the flora, fauna, and geology of West Africa in more detail, the cove attracted the attention of a few naturalists. Their journals, now stored in archives, describe standing on the shore at night and noting vowel-like sounds drifting over the waves. These observers, schooled in the acoustic sciences of their time, speculated about the resonant properties of the cliff and the role of wind direction. While their language lacked the precision of modern spectrographic analysis, they were attentive to the patterns, noting that the most distinct sounds occurred when the wind moved in from the south-southwest during an incoming tide. Such descriptions, though sparse, helped bridge the gap between local oral tradition and Western scientific curiosity. In the 20th century, with the spread of portable audio recording equipment, researchers were able to capture extended sessions of the cove's whispers. Some of these recordings, made on reel-to-reel tape in the 1960s, are housed at universities in both Ghana and abroad. When played back, they reveal the shifting interplay between steady wind tones and the percussive rhythm of waves, creating an almost conversational texture. Linguists who have analyzed these tapes remark on the human tendency to impose meaning on ambiguous sounds, a process known as pareidolia, which explains why so many listeners report hearing names. Interestingly, when the recordings are played to people unfamiliar with the cove's reputation, they often identify the words as belonging to their own language, whether Akan, Ewe, English, or another tongue entirely. The cove's acoustic behavior is also shaped by the interaction between air and water temperatures. On calm nights, when the sea surface cools more slowly than the land, a gentle onshore breeze develops, feeding directly into the cove's mouth. This breeze is typically more stable and less gusty than daytime winds, allowing the tones to sustain and develop into sequences that can be interpreted as syllables. Conversely, on nights when inland heat persists or competing air currents disturb the flow, the sound fragments into irregular bursts, reducing the impression of speech. Fishermen who have camped on the beach for years can often predict, by smell and by the feel of the air on their skin, whether the whispers will occur before they even hear them. Beyond its natural intrigue, Nsawam Frama has, in recent decades, become a modest point of interest for travelers seeking less commercialized experiences of Ghana's coastline. Guides from nearby villages sometimes lead small groups down the path after sunset, timing their arrival for when conditions are most likely to produce the effect. Visitors are encouraged to stand still for several minutes, allowing their ears to adjust to the blend of ocean and wind before the whispers become apparent. In the glow of lantern light, the experience feels intimate and strangely personal, even in the company of others. It is in such moments that modern tourism intersects with age-old wonder, offering the same sense of mystery that once drew storytellers to the cove's edge. There are, of course, other places in the world where wind and rock conspire to mimic human voices. The singing dunes of Kazakhstan produce low, rumbling tones when sand grains slide down a slope. Certain sea caves in Cornwall emit groans and whistles as waves compress the air within them. Yet Nsawam Frama stands apart because of the specificity of its sounds, the way they seem to articulate discrete, name-like phrases rather than continuous notes or abstract noise. This quality has made it harder to explain away as a mere curiosity. It resists dismissal, lingering in the listener's memory with the weight of something almost said. In Ghanaian coastal culture, names carry significance beyond simple identification. They can mark the day of the week on which a person was born, reflect ancestral heritage, or convey aspirations and blessings. To hear one's name in the voice of the sea is not an idle coincidence. It can be interpreted as an acknowledgement from forces larger than oneself. Some elders caution that the beach's whispers should not be taken lightly, especially if the name heard belongs to someone absent or deceased. Others treat the event as a harmless marvel, a gift of nature to be enjoyed without seeking deeper meaning. In either case, the moment when the wind seems to call you remains vivid. The sands here, pale and fine-grained, have been shaped by centuries of tidal movement. During the day, they retain the heat of the sun, releasing it slowly into the cooling night air. This warmth contributes to subtle convection currents that draw the sea breeze inland, further feeding the cove's acoustics. The tide plays its own part, as water levels change the way waves reflect sound off the cliff face. At high tide, the base of the cliff is awash, and the air column within certain hollows resonates more strongly, like a partially submerged bell. At low tide, the exposure of more rock changes the tonal balance, sometimes muting the voice entirely. These cycles give the beach a rhythm not unlike breathing, with each phase of the tide offering a slightly different timbre. For those who live nearby, the whispers are woven into the seasonal calendar. They are most frequent during the transitional months between rainy and dry seasons, when wind directions are variable and nights are calm enough for the sound to carry. Children growing up in the area learn to listen for them on certain evenings, often lying awake in bed with the window open, waiting for the faintest trace of speech. Adults hear them while repairing nets or mending boats late into the night, the voices mingling with the creak of wood and the slap of water against the hull. In this way, the phenomenon is not an isolated spectacle but part of the ongoing soundtrack of life along this stretch of the Gulf. And so the beach continues its quiet work, night after night, year after year, shaping air into patterns that stir the imagination. The scientific explanations do not diminish the enchantment, just as folklore does not obscure the physics. Both can exist side by side, each enriching the other. In the moonlight, with the surf drawing silver lines across the sand, the whispers rise again, carrying names that may be yours or mine, or no one's at all, before fading into the steady breath of the ocean. Welcome, voyager, and settle in for a tale that drifts not by compass but by the direction of the wind itself. On our final tale of the night, we sail into the strange world of early sea charts, those fragile sheets of parchment where islands could appear perfectly familiar yet curiously inverted, their northern cliffs pointing south and their harbors facing the wrong horizon. It is the story of a time before map-making was locked to the fixed idea of north, when seafarers cared more about the course of approach than the abstract geometry of the globe. We will explore why these islands were drawn upside down, how wind and route shaped their portrayal, and what this reveals about a world still stitching its maritime knowledge together. Somewhere in this narrative, you may find your own sense of direction quietly questioned. Of course, there is a certain comfort in knowing that if your map seems upside down, you might simply be holding it like a sailor from the 15th century. The difference is they might have argued that you were upside down instead. So before we capsize our sense of orientation entirely, remember to like this voyage and subscribe for more. Drop a coordinate in the comments, your latitude and longitude will do, and if a story drifts near your location, we may set our course there in a future expedition. So loosen your grip on the known compass points. Picture the creak of wooden beams in a gentle swell, the scent of brine mingling with warm air, and a horizon washed in late light. Let the quiet air wrap around you as the tide carries us into history. Our story tonight begins in the age of the portolan chart, those richly detailed navigational maps used by mariners in the Mediterranean and later the Atlantic during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. Drawn on vellum and inked with astonishing precision for their time, these charts recorded coastlines, ports, and hazards with a degree of accuracy that sometimes surprises modern observers. Yet, for all their detail, the orientation of features was not standardized to a north-up perspective. Instead, islands and coastlines were often rotated according to the prevailing direction from which a navigator would most likely approach. For example, if sailors typically reached an island from the west, the cartographer might draw it so that its western shore faced the bottom of the page, giving mariners a visual alignment that matched their own real-world viewpoint as they closed in on land. This practice reflected the lived experience of navigation in an age when wind and current dictated travel far more than magnetic bearings. In the Mediterranean, for instance, seasonal winds such as the Mistral or the Sirocco determined the most reliable approach routes. A mariner who always arrived at an island with a particular headland looming to starboard would find it intuitive for the map to present that headland in the same relative position. To modern eyes, conditioned by centuries of north-oriented maps, this seems counterintuitive. But to the navigator of the 14th or 15th century, the chart was less a miniature globe and more a memory aid for an anticipated approach. The concept of a fixed north was not unknown. Compasses had been in use in Europe since at least the 13th century, but it was not yet dominant in cartographic convention. Instead, portolan charts relied on a web of rum lines, radiating from compass roses across the vellum, marking the bearings a ship might sail along. These lines were drawn relative to a central grid, but the depiction of landmasses was still fluid, especially for smaller features like islands. The result was a hybrid between geometric navigation aids and practical visual mnemonics. It was a system that served its mariners well, even if it left later historians puzzling over apparent inconsistencies. One notable example comes from charts of the Balearic Islands in the 14th century. Some depict Majorca with its mountainous spine running horizontally across the page rather than vertically as it would appear on a modern map. This orientation reflected the approach from Barcelona, a key departure point for trade and travel, in which the mountains did indeed stretch across the mariner's field of vision. Similarly, certain depictions of the Azores and Madeira in early Atlantic charts show them at varying rotations, depending on whether the mapmaker was working from Portuguese, Genoese, or later Spanish sources, each shaped by different routes and prevailing winds. The practice was not merely aesthetic, it could serve as a subtle safety feature. By presenting the island in a familiar orientation, the chart reinforced the mariner's mental image, making it easier to recognize the coastline in poor visibility or from a distance. In an era before standardized lighthouses or electronic navigation, such cognitive reinforcement could mean the difference between a safe landfall and a dangerous misjudgment. For islands ringed with reefs or shallow approaches, the memory of a certain cliff face or harbor line was as critical as any bearing measured with a compass. We must also remember that mapmaking was a craft passed through apprenticeships, with each school inheriting the habits of its predecessors. A Catalan cartographer trained under a master accustomed to rotating an island for clarity might continue that tradition without questioning its logic, especially if their clients, the sailors, expected it. These traditions could persist for generations, meaning that an island might appear upside down in charts long after improved navigational tools had made such orientation less necessary. There is an anthropological layer to this as well. In many cultures, up on a map is not synonymous with north. Ancient Egyptian maps often placed the south at the top, aligning with the flow of the Nile. Medieval Islamic maps, influenced by scholars like Al-Idrisi, sometimes oriented south up, reflecting both symbolic and practical considerations. The European north-up standard did not become universal until the printing revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries helped codify map conventions. Until then, orientation remained flexible, and the positioning of an island could say as much about the sailor's journey as it did about the land itself. Wind charts from the same period show just how central prevailing breezes were to navigation. In the Atlantic, the Portuguese mariners of the 15th century relied heavily on the volta do mar, a technique that used the consistent northeast trade winds to reach the Azores or Madeira, even if it meant initially sailing away from the intended destination. The mental maps they carried were therefore structured not around direct lines but around loops and arcs of wind-driven travel. In such a mental framework, the correct orientation of an island was the one you saw as you came upon it, not the one determined by abstract cartographic convention. It is in this context that we can understand why some islands persisted in their inverted depictions well into the early modern period. As long as the approach routes remained the same, there was no pressing reason to reorient the image. Only when printed atlases began to prioritize uniformity, catering to a broader audience of readers rather than working mariners, did the incentive to turn these islands northward outweigh the habit of leaving them as they were. By that time, navigation was entering a new era, one in which global perspective and consistency became more valued than individual familiarity. Yet, there is a certain charm in these older charts, where the idea of up was not dictated by an invisible pole but by the tangible experience of arrival. To look upon them now is to step into the shoes of sailors who measured the world not from a fixed point but from the shifting line where sea meets land. Their maps were not only tools but reflections of movement, shaped as much by wind and water as by ink and compass. As the 16th century advanced, the influence of printed cartography began to erode the local and highly personal orientation choices of earlier maps. The rise of great European publishing centers, Antwerp, Venice, Amsterdam, meant that maps were now designed not for a single navigator or a small group of mariners familiar with a region, but for an expanding market of merchants, scholars, and curious gentry. The engraving plate, once cut, demanded consistency. If a Mediterranean island was drawn with north at the top in one plate, the printer had little reason to produce a separate version rotated for sailors approaching from the south. This new standardization was efficient for the printer and reassuring for buyers who wished to compare maps without mentally flipping their coastlines. Yet for the working sailor, especially those navigating in remote waters, this uniformity sometimes came at the cost of losing the intuitive arrival view that the old charts provided. Despite this shift, certain traditions persisted in niche contexts. Portolan-style manuscript maps continued to be produced well into the 17th century, especially in places where localized knowledge still mattered, among fishing communities, coastal traders, or in military settings where approach routes were predictable. Some naval maps, kept from public circulation, retained these unconventional orientations because they served a very specific operational purpose. A fleet planning an assault on an island fortress, for example, might commission a map drawn from the exact vantage of the expected approach, showing the fortress upright relative to the fleet's course, regardless of true north. In these cases, the map was less an abstract representation and more a form of tactical illustration. It is worth noting that this concept of orientation by approach is not confined to European tradition. In parts of the Pacific, indigenous navigators conceptualized island positions in relation to star paths, ocean swells, and the direction of travel, rather than fixed compass points. Some Marshallese stick charts, for instance, were designed to be read from the perspective of a canoe traveling along a known route, with islands placed to match how they would appear in sequence, rather than their strict geographic bearings. Although these charts were not rotated in the European sense, the principle was similar. Spatial representation was organized around the journey, not the universal grid. The persistence of such approach-based thinking even within modern contexts is visible in certain aerial charts used for small craft aviation. Pilots often study approach plates that depict runways and surrounding terrain as they will appear during a final descent, rotated to match the pilot's actual heading rather than magnetic north. In this way, the centuries-old seafaring logic of orienting maps for intuitive arrival still finds echoes today, though in a different medium. The human brain, after all, remains more comfortable interpreting spatial information when it matches immediate sensory experience. Returning to the early sea charts, one can trace the gradual reconciliation between functional orientation and symbolic orientation. By the time of Gerardus Mercator's famous 1569 world map, the convention of north-up had become more firmly entrenched, propelled in part by the demands of a world increasingly understood as a single connected space rather than a patchwork of familiar routes. The Mercator projection itself, while introducing distortions in landmass size, allowed sailors to plot straight-line courses along constant compass bearings, which in turn reinforced the primacy of a consistent directional standard. In this new environment, the upside-down island was no longer an accepted quirk. It became an error to be corrected. Yet this was not a simple matter of progress. In discarding variable orientations, cartography also discarded a deeply human element of spatial representation. The rotated island carried within it the story of prevailing winds, habitual ports of call, and the particular way a sailor first set eyes on a shore. Without it, the chart became more abstract and less personal, a reflection of the globe as an object rather than the sea as an experience. For historians today, these inverted islands serve as quiet reminders that maps are cultural artifacts as much as technical tools, shaped by the lives and habits of those who make and use them. Archival work reveals that some cartographers wrestled with this transition. Letters from 16th century mapmakers occasionally complain of patrons demanding proper orientation, even when the cartographer believed the older layout was more useful. In rare cases, compromises were made. The island would be drawn in true north orientation but accompanied by a small inset showing the approach view from a specific route. Such insets are scarce, perhaps because they required additional work and space, but they offer a fascinating glimpse into the negotiation between old habits and new standards. One particularly illustrative example comes from a 1584 Venetian chart of the Aegean. The main body of the map shows the islands in fixed north-up alignment, but in the corner, a series of small profile drawings depicts each island as seen from the deck of an approaching ship. These profiles are rotated relative to the map itself, subtly preserving the seafarer's perspective without disrupting the overall alignment. For modern viewers, such drawings make clear the gap between the abstracted symbol of an island on parchment and the lived reality of encountering it at sea. Of course, the notion of upside down is itself relative. From the perspective of a sailor rounding Cape Horn from the Pacific, much of the world might appear inverted compared to the familiar layout in a European atlas. The very idea that north is inherently up is a convention born of certain cultural and historical choices, not an intrinsic truth. Inverting an island, then, was less an error and more a reminder that orientation is a matter of perspective. The wind, the stars, the swell, and the course all dictate a traveler's frame of reference, and a map that ignores these can be as misleading as one that distorts distance. There is also the intriguing possibility that some rotated depictions were as much about symbolism as utility. In a few medieval portlands, islands associated with religious pilgrimage or legendary events are oriented to highlight a specific feature, perhaps a church or a miraculous site, toward the top of the image, regardless of compass direction. In these cases, the rotation becomes a visual emphasis, a way of drawing the viewer's eye toward what the mapmaker considered most important. This blending of the practical and the symbolic is one of the qualities that makes early cartography such a rich field of study. By the close of the 17th century, the days of the routinely rotated island were largely over in European cartography, replaced by the dominance of printed atlases and navigational manuals. The age of exploration had expanded the map to encompass every known continent, and the emphasis shifted toward a unified, standardized representation. Still, in the margins and archives, these earlier maps endure, holding their inverted islands like little pockets of resistance to the global grid. They remind us that for centuries, up was wherever the wind carried you, and a map was not merely a window onto the world, but a reflection of the way you entered it. In modern times, the upside-down island sometimes resurfaces in a different context, the intentional artistic subversion of cartographic norms. Contemporary map artists and cultural commentators occasionally choose to rotate familiar landmasses in order to challenge the viewer's assumptions about geography and orientation. A well-known example is the South Up world map, which flips the traditional North Up convention entirely. While these are rarely practical navigation tools, they echo the same reminder inherent in the old rotated islands, that the way we present space is shaped by perspective, and that perspective is neither fixed nor universal. By altering orientation, these works invite the viewer to think critically about why certain arrangements feel right and others seem disorienting. In places with strong maritime traditions, especially islands themselves, there is sometimes a residual pride in the way earlier generations represented their surroundings. Local museums in the Azores, the Canary Islands, and the Cyclades occasionally display antique charts with prominent orientation peculiarities, noting the ways they served specific ports and routes. For the people who live there, these maps are not mere curiosities but artifacts of their ancestors' relationship with the sea, when a chart was as much a companion as an instrument. The rotated depiction, whether drawn for utility or tradition, reflected the lived realities of wind, tide, and arrival, and those realities remain central to local identity. Digital mapping, with its ability to rotate and zoom seamlessly, has in a way restored the lost flexibility of orientation, though in a different form. Navigation apps can reorient the map to match the user's current direction, an automatic convenience that mirrors the seafarer's old habit of turning the chart to match the view ahead. On a phone screen, this reorientation feels entirely natural, yet it is essentially the same principle that made an upside-down island perfectly sensible to a 15th century sailor. In both cases, the goal is to make spatial information immediately intuitive, even if it defies the global standard. There is an irony in the fact that some of the most advanced navigational tools now replicate, through dynamic display, the very logic that fixed printed maps once abandoned. The rotating island of the past was a static adaptation for a specific user. Today's rotation is instant and personalized for anyone, anywhere. In this sense, the digital age has unintentionally brought us back to the notion that north does not always need to be up. The difference is that now, orientation is no longer fixed by the cartographer's hand, but chosen moment by the traveler. Still, there is a tactile romance to the old method. A navigator in the age of sail would physically rotate a parchment or vellum chart, aligning the drawn coastline with the real horizon. The creak of the table, the smell of salt air, and the dim light of a swinging lantern would accompany the gesture, transforming the map from an abstract diagram into a living reflection of the journey. The rotated island in that setting was not a mistake but an affirmation. The map was made for this course, for this ship, for this wind. Such moments remind us that maps are not static records but living documents shaped by the needs and priorities of their users. They are as much about the act of travel as they are about the land or sea being depicted. In the upside-down island, we see a microcosm of this truth, a small but telling adjustment that speaks volumes about the realities of navigation in a pre-standardized world. It is a visual shorthand for a relationship between traveler and place, one where orientation is chosen for usefulness, not conformity. One of the more striking historical finds in this regard comes from a 15th century Catalan chart showing the island of Elba inverted relative to the Italian mainland. While this might seem inconvenient to anyone approaching from the north, it made perfect sense for sailors arriving from Corsica, whose trade winds often dictated the approach route. For those mariners, the upside-down version was in fact the correct one. Modern observers might label it an error, but to its intended audience, it was the most accurate representation available. The map did not strive to please everyone, only the people who actually needed it. When studying such examples, it becomes clear that the term upside down is inherently misleading. It suggests a universal orientation that does not truly exist outside of a given convention. In reality, the rotated island is only wrong if judged against a standard that did not apply to its maker or user. This realization invites a broader reflection on how many other visual systems we take for granted are shaped by tradition rather than necessity. Whether in cartography, architecture, or even storytelling, the most natural arrangement often depends on where you begin. Even in the age of satellites and GPS, a few specialized printed charts continue to use non-standard orientations. Certain coastal rescue maps, for example, are oriented toward the most common point of departure for search and rescue vessels, ensuring that crews can interpret them instantly under pressure. These rare modern holdouts preserve the logic of the upside-down island in the service of speed and clarity, proving that the practice still has practical merit in the right context. Ultimately, the phenomenon of the rotated island is not just a footnote in cartographic history. It is a reminder of the adaptability and human focus that once defined navigation. It tells us that the sea was not crossed with a fixed and universal frame of reference, but with charts that mirrored the realities of wind, current, and approach. To look at such a map today is to glimpse a moment when orientation was personal, when up could be wherever the journey began, and when the shape of the world on paper bent to the needs of those who traveled it. And so, as we fold this voyage away and return the chart to its case, the upside-down islands remain, scattered across the archives of maritime history. They are quiet witnesses to a time before the map became a uniform grid, when the world was drawn not as a detached observer would see it, but as a traveler would arrive to meet it. In their inversion lies a kind of truth, that the shape of a place is inseparable from the path that brings you there, and that sometimes the best way up is down.